Good afternoon. My name is Carita Wallgren-Lindholm. I'm a local attorney, and I have the privilege to moderate this session where we have visitors from all over Europe. We were considering also to cover Asia, the LCIA, the Lonely Island, some people now call it, and the US, but we figured that we didn't have capacity to cover all those regions, so we will focus on continental Europe. You will have noted that the panel discussion is on the role of the Secretariat and its activity in monitoring the arbitral process, which, as we know, in an ad hoc arbitration is monitored by the Arbitral Tribunal. There is some overlap, I think, to the excellent session that preceded this one. There is some challenge to start being interesting and witty after what we heard from Inka and Maria, but we will do our best. You all know this, but I will still remind you that when the parties enter into an arbitration agreement, which provides for an institution to manage the proceedings and to be the administrative body, this is binding as a contract, and that they thereby outsource certain decisions to the institution, and then the institution continues to perform certain tasks after the main decision makers, i.e. the arbitral tribunal, who will decide on the merits of the dispute, begins its work, and also in the course of such work. I will begin by introducing our panel. It's easy to say we have three Secretary Generals, or we have two Secretary Generals and one Secretary General elect. To my very left is Alexander Fessas from the ICC. He's now managing counsel, right? And you will be the new Secretary General in less than 2 weeks' time. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And then we have a Secretary General from the west of Finland, from Stockholm, Annette Magnusson, I think known to most of you. She doesn't have novelty value in the sense that you have been at the helm of the Stockholm Chamber for quite some time. You can read their CVs. I think they are on the website, at least. But I'd like to say about Annette, since I have the floor and I can say what I'm pleased to say, that Annette has been much of a thought leader, I think, in this part of the world. She has done two things. She has been innovative, I think, and also she has raised arbitration to a higher ground by the arbitrating for peace, which means that in the discussion that we had when everybody was complaining about arbitration and the cost, she took it to a new level and said, this is really necessary for us to preserve peace in the world. I think that was a good deed. Then we have our very own Heidi, who requires no more introductions today. But what I would like to say is that Heidi has done a tremendous job in very short time, I think, with the Finnish institution, a remarkable turnaround. Then we have Ulrike, who will speak to the Germanic part of Europe, DIS and Wojtek. And Ulrike is in private practice with Heuking Kühn, and I think that most of you know her also. Welcome, Ulrike. And then we have a former president of the Swiss Chambers, Philipp, it says very discreetly in your CV that you were a partner in a major law firm in Switzerland. I think it was La Live. And we also have the current president of the Swiss chambers in the room. She will appear later, Gabrielle Natabas. So you're very, very welcome. I am, as a moderator should, not intending to take up too much time. I will say what we'll try to do, and we will try to first see at the intensity by which these various institutions monitor the arbitral process. We have already discussed scrutiny here, and I think that it goes from administration light to more intense monitoring. And I also think that, Philipp, I've heard you say on some panel across the seas that you think that you strike a balance between very light administration in Switzerland and very intense. I also like to say that I think it is a very nice thing to have the Finnish chamber have this ecumenic approach to gather various institutions. I think you are friendly competitors, and I also think that it raises awareness. Discussion is good. I think there's been a convergence in best practices. The rules are largely similar, as we heard Mika say, that the FI has taken after the ICC. So that must mean also that a lot of the differences actually lie in the soft skills, in what is actually being done. I think that having all these institutions present, it's like maybe having on the same street the Prada and the Max Mara. You know, it sort of draws the attention. They don't play out one another, they actually increase the interest and the importance. So I said I shouldn't say more right now, and I will join my panelists at the chair section in the drawing room, and we will start the debate. May I first ask you, I think we'll do it in the order we're seated, to just explain very briefly your institution. Your institution is the ICC.
My institution is the ICC, yes. Thank you, Carita, for those introductory remarks, and thank you, Heidi, for having invited us and for having organized all of this, and particularly this panel, which I think is, for institutional sake, is very important. Well, I think I should limit myself because you heard about it already. The ICC court administers cases since the 1920s, more than 22,000 cases. And if your question is why the ICC, what the distinctive feature is, I think on the scale of engagement, and I won't use words light or intense. Actually, intense is, I think, not a good word to put it. Or light is also probably not a very good word to put it. But on the level of engagement, I think we are higher on the mark. And that is basically what parties expect out of an ICC process. And apart from that, there are two other defining features. The first one, probably the most important one, is the work that the ICC court does in ensuring validity of awards and successful enforceability of awards through the review of draft awards, which is known as scrutiny. And the second is the ability that the ICC court has in instilling its experience from being a truly global provider of case management services into both international and domestic cases. So if I had 3 sentences, this is what I would have said.
Thank you, Alex. Annette, standalone speech or contrasting to Alex?
Thank you, and thank you also, Carita, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here as always in Helsinki. It feels like being home, so introducing the SSC to this audience feels like you already know everything, right? But defining features of the SSC, clearly we are a sort of a regional institution compared to the ICC, although last year we had parties from more than 40 different jurisdictions appearing in the close to 200 cases at the SSC. So it's actually fairly widespread. And if you look at the sort of the content of the cases at the SSC, what we see is a very strong East-West dimension. Still, I'm inclined to say there is sometimes the perception that that is changing, and one could say that it's widening the diversity of the SSC case law, but you still have this strong presence of the East-West element, I would say. And last year, in fact, we had a very strong increase in the number of parties from CIS countries, particularly Russia and Ukraine. And also in terms of substance, if you look at the SSC, one thing that stands out, it's the energy cases, which of course contributes to the high value that we see. So currently we have pending cases of a value of 50 billion euros, so it's fairly large. And another third feature, which is sort of special for the SSC in Sweden, is the strong presence in investor-state disputes. And this, of course, emanating from the fact that we have at least 120 bilateral investment treaties giving a role to the SSC or to Stockholm or Sweden in these types of disputes. So it's sort of a unique role for a small country in Northern Europe to have so many of these cases, where we are the second after World Bank in terms of managing investor-state cases under our own rules. And in terms of how closely we follow the cases, how hands-on we are, I suppose we are one of the institutions you would say somewhere in between, right? So we follow the cases. We have a list of documents that we want the tribunal to share with us once we have referred the case to the tribunal, but we don't want them to share everything, right? So we keep an eye on what's happening in the case through certain defined documents, notably separate awards or procedural orders, schedules, timetables, and so forth. But we don't want to sit right and follow the case too closely, because that's not our role. That's not how we operate the cases. I think we will come more into the details later in terms of what we do and what that means in practice. So I'll just stop here for now.
Heidi, are you a regional player, or how would you define the Finnish Institute?
I would say, as Annette as well said, so I think our institute is a regional player, but of course we want to be seen as an international arbitration institute, so we don't administer only domestic cases, and that has been the way we had for many years already. As I said in my opening remarks, 36% of the cases were international last year, meaning that one of the parties were at least non-Finns, and some truly international cases as well. But we have been around for a long time. As I said, we are 106 years old. We are proud to be old. And that means also that we have a lot of experience in administering the cases. Of course, a big year for us was 2013 when we revised our rules. And it was a big revision. And now we have rules that really correspond to the international standard and include all elements you need to administer complex cases. And as to the administrative work we do, I would say that we are also in the same way as CC is somewhere in between, and not too heavy, but still closely following the process and having contacts with the arbitrators and parties as well.
I do think that you require a bit less copies than the SCC, probably.
We try to require less and less.
Yeah. Yes. Well, we can revert to that. Ulrike, if you would care to address the DIS from your home jurisdiction, and then VIAC, and then it would be nice also if you would speak to how German or Austrian they are, and if they are, and what is in the offing.
Well, thanks for also being able to present the Germanic part, whatever that is, of arbitration world here. So the DIS actually is a rather old institution. We're still, in terms of party timing, I think, discussing what is the real date to fix. There's a date in 1920 when sort of the first predecessors of this sort of were established. There was 2 organizations which were then merged in 1984. And DIS actually, I think, was a very German institution for a long time. We have rather old rules, 1998, which have rather basic rules. At the moment, entire Germany is busy, at least arbitration community, with revising these rules, so the sky is the limit. And that brings incredible, intelligent and academic discussions about what to do, what do we need, and who are we, and where do we want to go. I think that's a very interesting process we have at the moment. I'm happy also maybe to share some thoughts, because the idea is still not to do a copy of ICC and be cheaper. The idea is really to have that we have the yellow color, to find the yellow in the rules, and to sort of give something which probably is Germanic. I think this is more or less a stringent sort of case management from the arbitration tribunal. We love open discussions with the parties and sort of to put that into a concept with the institution. The figures, just to give you a little idea of cases administered by this, have increased over the years. We're talking about, I think last year was something like 172 cases. However, still more than 75% of the cases have at least one German party. So the real true international cases are unfortunately still not yet there, but may come. DIS has a multitude of different rules. It's not only the arbitration rules, but they have also a particular sports arbitration, sports rules. They have all kinds of expert determination, dispute rules, particular rules for commercial or corporate disputes. So there's quite a variety, I think, on that level, which is interesting, and which will not be revised yet. Sort of, we have in particular focusing on the main rules. We have what is, I think, separates DIS from or distincts it from many other institutions is we are standalone. We don't have a chamber of commerce to which we are connected, but that changes some things, and not only in the administration and funding, but it gives an interesting aspect. In contrast that, if I come quickly to our Austrian neighbors, the Vienna International Arbitration Center only administers international cases, which means, to the Austrian understanding, this is a case where at least one party is not Austrian. They call themselves to be beautiful but smart and small. In particular, they have something around 60 cases per year which they administer, but with a highly professional team behind. I think, of course, most of the parties have, or cases have at least one Austrian party, and then you would have the respective foreigner. They have revised the rule in 2013. They are attached to the Wiener Handelskammer, Wirtschaftskammer, so they are integrated into a further cooperation from which they benefit also by providing rooms and having little other further atu to assist. And I think German, to come back to your last question, how German or how Austrian are they? I think the WIAG, I mean, the name says it's always extraordinary international with the lovely Vienna's Schmäh, as we call it. So have this, the best of Austria in the international arbitration world, I think. Very, very open, and in particular trying to attract this international clientele they need. DIS got extremely international over the last few years. We have Francesca Mazza as a Secretary General, who is, I think, in herself, the way she works is more German than any German, but she has Italian and French background, and she attracts, she comes from the ICC, so she really has that international background, and she attracts now also as case managers lots of foreigners. We have Suri, luckily taken from Finland via Sweden, and so we have quite a lot of also other nationals who do the case management.
Thank you, Ulrike. And now, Philipp, I realize that you may also be part of Germanic, but I think the Swiss is a bit standalone. Would you like to open up a little bit how you see the Swiss chambers?
Yes, the Swiss chambers, the current institution has been formed in 2004. Before that, the 7 participated local chambers of commerce have been offering their own arbitration services under their own set of rules, some going back to 1869, like in Basel, or 1911 in Zurich, same year as here in Finland. They then formed a Swiss Verein, and that's now the institution. It also added a bit to the independence of the court, of course, from the chambers of commerce. The rules are based on the Arbitral arbitration rules, but of course there have been some amendments and adaptations to make them suitable for institutional arbitration. There is roughly about 100 cases per year, predominantly international. I'd say 90% international. Since 2004, parties from about more than 110 countries have participated in Swiss rules arbitrations. There is maybe some Swiss element in the sense that in about 20% of all cases there is a Swiss parties, but in the vast majority there is none. But the seat is predominantly in Switzerland in more than 90% of all cases, and Swiss law is the law most frequently chosen in about 75% of the cases. But we have also quite a number of cases under German, Italian, French, or English law. Similarly, the languages used are around, I have the figures here. Let me check. I think it's 75% about English as well, and then we have, no, sorry, it's 2/3 English, about 15% German and French, and then 5% Italian, and then sometimes we have a case in Russian or in Spanish, but that's rather the exception. Speaking of level of engagement, I think we are at the lower end. The function of the court and the Secretariat really is to set the proceedings in motion, to constitute the tribunal, to see or assist to make sure that the proceedings are not derailed, and then the cost control at the end. So we would not be getting a lot of copies. It's primarily the decisions of the arbitral tribunal, be it awards, timetable, or procedural orders, but not much more than that.
Let me ask you another question, and then we can go the other way back. I realize we're now talking about the monitoring of the secretariats, but if we assume, which I am, that there's been a great convergence in the rules. You read the rules, but then sometimes they are implemented maybe slightly differently, or there are certain understandings that are not declared. And if we assume that the sign of a truly international institution is one which understands which are things that are not self-evident to a practitioner, would you say that if you come and plead under the Swiss rules and in contact with your secretariat, that it's easy for arbitrators from another jurisdiction or for counsel from another jurisdiction?
I wouldn't think that there are a lot of secrets because, as I said, the rules are based on the Arbitral rules. There are a few provisions, though, which I think are clearly distinctive from similar provisions in other rules. I think one of the main facets of Swiss rules arbitration is that there are more powers with the tribunal than with the institution. For instance, joinder is entirely dealt with by the tribunal. Unless the application for joinder is made prior to the constitution, then it would be dealt with as a multi-party case by the court in constituting the arbitral tribunal. As well, when it comes to dealing with advances for costs, it would actually be the tribunal in the first place who would determine the amount of the advances in consultation with the Secretariat. Some guidance would be given by the Secretariat, but the tribunal has the last word as well when it comes to decide whether or not separate advances will be requested. And the court or the Secretariat would only come in at the very end with the cost control and have the final word there. But prior to that, I guess there's more work or decisions to be rendered by the arbitral tribunal and not by the institution, in contrast to some of the other institutional rules.
Ulrike, that is also probably has been the tradition in Germany,
Still.
that it is the arbitral tribunal and not the institution.
We have, under the still current existing rules, we have all the power is with the tribunal. Even the tribunal decides on its own challenge, which is definitely something which will change. But so the idea is that the tribunal is vested with all rights. For the moment, it's still the tribunal that also collects the advance on costs. So it does the cost control and monitoring itself, and it also determines the amount in dispute and fixes its own fee by that, sort of in accordance with the scale, which surely are things to be changed, but it's in particular the assessment of the amount in dispute, and which then sort of runs into the determination of the fees, which we have not on an hourly basis, but on the amount of dispute, is, I think it's getting a generation-wise issue of arbitral understanding in Germany, that we have the discussions now for the new rules. where we wanted to shift all that to the institution, which of course raises then subsequent questions. How much information does an institution need in order to be able to take all these decisions? Do we constantly include the institution like the ICC, for example, in everything and nothing, which means you need more staffing, that needs to be paid, you must increase your fees? Or do we just keep the institution out of the relevant things, and whenever they have a lack of information, the institution would be called to ask the parties or the tribunals to provide the information? That's, I think, an issue which can be substantially discussed, but it is a delicate situation if you are in institutional arbitration and you decide on your costs and you ask the parties to pay in the fees and you tell them, if you don't pay your advance in costs, we won't proceed with the hearing. I mean, or with the case. This is typical to ad hoc arbitration, and we want to offer an institution. This is one of the reasons why these ancient rules will definitely be changed by the end of the year.
Yes, I guess it's a fair statement that many arbitrators think, and I'm certainly one of them, that it's nice to not have to administer the fees and the money, and to start off when you meet the parties for the first time, to start saying, you know, that you want now to discuss the monetary issue. So I think that is something that many are happy to leave to the institution.
And also an organizational issue. I think inside the tribunal there are the most crazy situations if the chair puts all the advance and costs on his private bank account, you know. It's a discussion you don't want to have inside the tribunal.
Thank you. Annette, I wanted to ask you about the SCC. I think that in the old days there was sometimes a perception that the Swedish international arbitration was very Swedish, that there were certain things that foreign arbitrators who came to Sweden, some unarticulated Swedish habits, practices that were difficult to grasp. Do you think that is still true?
So if I can just answer that by sort of returning to your initial remark in the way that rules are becoming more alike, and so what happens behind sort of the wording of the rules. I think that's a very valid observation, which sort of in a sense reflects not only what happens in international arbitration, but in the world in general. It is really not about what we do or what we offer, it's how we do it. It's not the what, it's the how. And it's extremely important for whatever line of business you're in, and also including international arbitration. So all the rules are more or less the same, I mean, to be honest. And I'm speaking now as an institution that just adopted new rules this year. And yes, we have some innovations, but we're not talking about that now. But so you will recognize most of the arbitration rules. So the differentiation factor is, how are they applied in practice? What happens when they are put to play? Because there is so much happening that is actually not in the rules, that you need to understand what happens in between the wording, so to speak. And one, which sort of alludes to your question, one trend or one development that we have seen, which goes to both sort of who sits in a tribunal and who sits at the Secretariat, is the increased internationalization of the entire field, including who sits at the Secretariat. If I'm looking at the SSC, we are 10 people, and I am a Swedish lawyer. I'm trained and based, I've lived my whole life more or less in Sweden. I'm married to a Swede. I have a Swedish degree. My mother tongue is Swedish. I am a small minority in my office. So the people that work in my office, they have their training somewhere else. They are of a different nationality. They have a different mother tongue. They are married to someone from another country and have lived outside of Sweden for a long time and then come back. I mean, all sorts of variations of that. But they bring that into their role at the Secretariat and the way they perform their function. And I think then in understanding whoever contacts them and whatever jurisdiction they come from and whatever area of law they are practicing. So I think that adds to the international understanding of the service that we are to offer. And also I think that adds to, when it comes to the appointment of the arbitrators, the building of the network, in addition, of course, to the fact that we have an international decision-making body, the SSC board making the decision. So there is a greater diversity there. And I think in the end there is an awareness that what we need to be able to do with all this is to make sure that international arbitration as understood in Sweden and elsewhere, delivers on the promise as was discussed in the keynote, on efficiency, on predictability in terms of transparency. Transparency to me, if you are a commercial institution, is really translated into predictability and understanding the procedures. Because that's what we need to deliver, and we need to be able to deliver it to all sorts of different nationalities and jurisdictions. And it's only by having that international outlook at the Secretariat and in applying our rules that we can do that. So to the extent we succeed of doing that, well, that's for you to decide, I suppose, and for the users, if we are living up to that promise. But I do think that if you compare what goes on in an institution today as for 10 years ago, it's a big change in terms of internationalization and the focus on really how we deliver under the rules. I don't know if I answered your question.
That was a very good response worth considering. Do you think, Heidi, that the Finnish institution has an international secretariat?
I would say so. We are now 5 people. I come from Finland. I have a similar background as Annette has. I've trained in Finland, had done some smaller periods abroad, but mainly from Finnish background. But then we have Adriana coming from Chile, lawyer from Chile, having worked here in a law firm first and then at the Secretariat. So she's a great asset for us, and with all her language skills, covering Spanish and German and so on. So I think already from that perspective, I think we can help also the international audience. And what we have seen is the increase in the amount of phone calls and different kind of contacts to the Secretariat from abroad. So it's not only the Finnish lawyers calling, but also foreign lawyers asking information about our institute and the rules.
And you feel also you understand the questions. I guess that is really, having the answer is one thing, but you have to understand the question because it of course reflects the context from which the question comes.
Yeah, I would say so, yeah. Of course, not always, it depends on the question, but yeah.
Well, Alex, I guess I don't need to ask you whether you think you have a multicultural and internationally well-versed Secretariat, but
you might as well, if you want.
Yes, I will. Okay, so this is a moment. This is a moment for you to say. But I think the ICC says that the ICC is global. It is not French. I don't know. Some could have argued before that the internal administrative culture was somewhat French. But today, how would you describe the management style? Because that's important also, the management style of the Secretariat.
Thank you, and that's a very important question. I almost wanted to jump and clap when Annette was making the comments that she was making, particularly the first part, because, and I don't think we can emphasize this enough, it is not the solutions under the rules. It is how the rules are being implemented that distinguishes and not in a negative way, in different light, distinguishes the services that are provided under one institution from another. There are increasing harmonizations and increasing single channelings of solutions, primarily for reasons of internationalization, but also because of trial and error. This is a business that is market-driven. You are there to answer questions, but also to understand the issues that will cause the questions tomorrow. And therefore, nobody's really inventing the wheel, or at least most of us would feel that we're not. There might be, in some respects, certain innovations coming from an institution or another institution at any given point of time, but nobody really works in a vacuum. So it's not the solutions, it's how they're being implemented. And I think that is important for users to understand. Now, having said that, and thank you, Annette, for making that point clear. Now, having said that, I think well beyond that, to answer your question, yes, the ICC Court is not and was not a French institution, and in that sense, I think we take pride in the fact that we are extremely international. I'm very fortunate to be the next Secretary General. I'm a Cypriot national. My predecessor was Italian. His predecessor was a Kiwi. My Deputy Secretary General will be Portuguese, her predecessor is Dominican, and his predecessor was Australian, and so on and so forth. So we do come from everywhere, and again, to borrow some of the remarks that Annette just made, the strength of the system is tested by the way that it responds to the user's needs. And when you want to cater to an audience that can be at any given time, both domestic or international or regional, you need to be able to provide solutions that make sense, service sense and business sense to all of them. And that is where you need staff, legal and otherwise, who will be trained under different jurisdictions, under different laws, who will have tested their strengths in arbitration, but also in different forms of law, and who will have also, and this is very important, I think, in the context of administered proceedings, a sense that you are a lawyer, but you're also there to provide a service, which is qualified from the service that a lawyer will provide in the context of a law firm. And that, I think, goes to your question of how is the process. And in that sense, yes, I think when one is running case management services and is not too attentive, processes tend to add up. And I think that is perhaps one of the reasons that everyone is also speaking in favor of an increased efficiency, not just from arbitrators or from counsel, but also from institutions. And that is a very, very valid point. I think it's one that we have addressed successfully in the past 5 years, and we still need to. We can discuss again, I think Heidi mentioned, and Annette and everybody else on the different chapters of an arbitral process. The last thing that I wanted to say with regard to the uniformity of solutions, but the difference in the manner in which the service is being provided, there are some exceptions. And when parties buy or contract into an institutionally administered process, the institution will always be more present in the very beginning of the case because there is no tribunal to decide these issues, and probably at the very end of the case, depending then, of course, on what kind of input it needs to provide. During the life of the case, again, many variations, but in principle, if the case is well administered and everybody's made the right choices, the presence of the institution is going to be quite discreet.
Thank you, Alex. I will now turn to the, I'll call you now collectively the Germanic part of this panel. I understood from your responses that maybe your institutional procedures have still sort of ad hoc features, ad hoc arbitration, because there are many things that the tribunal does that in other systems are for the institution to perform. And the question is, do you think that there is a development towards more administrative functions being taken by the institution and its secretariat instead of the arbitral tribunal handling them? Ulrike?
Well, I think maybe for the VIAC, they do administer quite a lot, and they even are the specialists in tax law, international tax law, and even collect any taxes which are due on arbitrators' remuneration up front when they request for the advance on costs, which I think as an arbitrator is a wonderful gift, and they administer that. So this is, I think, they are not that Germanic in that respect and that ad hoc. But for the DIS at the moment, yes, we are. I mean, I think the DIS, you can call it at any time, and they will help out or give information. That's not the issue. But in terms of procedural steps that need to be taken at the moment, it is as soon as the arbitral tribunal is constituted, the entire everything shifts to the tribunal. The only thing is then the DIS notifies the award, and they do a little pre-scrutiny if you wish so. But for the rest, it's the entire proceeding is in the hands of the arbitral tribunal, and it definitely will change. However, the degree and the lightness with which the arbitral tribunal will be sort of guided by the institution also, or the proceedings, I think is a matter which we have really intensely discussed, because in these days we talk about transparency. the parties choose a tribunal whom they know, they trust, they want to administrate the case or to run the case. So the question is like which tasks can be easily substituted or delegated, and to what degree is the institution coming a fourth or second arbitrator. And this is definitely, I think, something which scares Germanic arbitration community. However, all knowing that there is a no-go, that you yourself administer your costs and you decide on your challenge. I mean, this is already per se a no-go to sit in front of the party who challenges an arbitrator and then you render your decision. It's archaic, and that definitely needs to be shifted to institution. I think the good mixture is necessary. We won't have too much influence, but at least a strong, solid support wherever necessary.
That was very interesting. If we have time, I'd like to come back to the fourth arbitrator concept. But Philipp, what would you say? Do you think that if there's further development, that it would go to more tasks being performed by the institute?
There has been a certain shift between the 2004 and the 2012 rule when it comes to the cost control in particular. I'm not sure whether in future revisions there will be a further shift towards more decision being taken by the institution. Let's just maybe address two examples. The advances on cost. If a party understates the interest in dispute, or if it makes a prayer for relief, which is not for monetary relief, declaratory relief, or specific performance, I would think, in principle, probably the tribunal, at least at a certain point in time, is in a better position to assess what the value of that claim is and to make a decision, how that value is to be determined and whether that justifies an increase of the advance in costs or not. They're probably in a better position than the institution at the very, very beginning. That is why, under our system, the Secretariat or the court makes an additional determination, but it tells the tribunal, listen, that's, according to our understanding right now, that's the value in dispute, which under the scales, leads to a fee range from here to there, and you can ask for an advance. It's more or less average plus 10%. That's about the approach the ICC takes as well when it fixes the advances. But you have the ultimate call in making the determination of the amount in dispute. And that changes. The tribunal can make the change in principle itself. It should consult the tribunal, but it has the last word.
So the tribunal decides then on the advance a bit into the proceedings.
Exactly, but it has an upper range, which is the average under the fee scale, and if it wants to go above that, it has to go further back to the Secretariat and make the inquiry.
So how easy is it? I think this is a question too. How easy is it for a tribunal? It's not a grateful task to go back and say, look, this is a much bigger case, much more complicated. Although I think that often you kind of sense that the arbitral institution says, yes, we only hear this 20 times a day, that this is a bigger, more complex, more everything case, and therefore the fee should go up. So that I guess one of the balances that the institution needs to strike is that I'm not saying whom are you trying to please, but you sometimes get the idea also that the institutions are very reluctant to increase advances. Would you agree with that?
Well, sometimes they are. I think it always depends on the circumstances and what arguments are made for the justification of the increase. I think the point which the Swiss rules make is that the tribunal ultimately has more knowledge, deeper knowledge about the file than the institution. So it's better placed to have the ultimate word, at least while the arbitration is in progress, where at the end, of course, then someone has to independently control the cost determination of the tribunal. So it's more a bit an institutionalization of the Unzitral system, where the tribunal makes a determination of its fees and expenses, but there is a pre-award control by the institution, which then either approves the determination made by the arbitral tribunal and will inquire as to the time spent, complexity, and so forth, or even adjust downwards if it believes that the fees are not justified. So that's a bit what we also call maybe the lower engagement of the institution on the cost side. And the same is, of course, true when it comes to the asking for separate advances, where the approach under our set of rules, rather as well the tribunal, because that can significantly change the dynamics of the proceedings if you're asking for separate advances. And again, maybe the tribunal knows the case better, maybe knows better what it means and whether it's truly justified. So we leave that decision to the tribunal and not to the institution.
Let me say this. I find it kind of difficult to understand to say, and I know Annette wants to pronounce it, but I had a sort of clarifying question to say that they are better placed. Yes, yes, but what's wrong with consultation and taking on board what the tribunal says? I mean, it's not either or. It's like it can be an interactive process. You said that they have the maneuvering space for the tribunal is up to an average. I think the average is kind of the normal. That would normally not take into account extraordinary complexity. So the question is really, if the tribunal says, look, this is really very complicated, now how do you see the likelihood of the institution saying, fine, you know, if this is what you say, because you know better than us?
Well, it's just a consultation of the institution under the Swiss rules. So actually, if the tribunal wants to increase the advance, it can,
yes,
even without the approval, unless it wants to go above the maximum. There, it would need the approval of the court. So the full control really only is at the end, and before it's a lower level of engagement. I think that's the wording Alex put quite nicely, and I like that expression. So there's no true need to really intervene for the institution at that stage. And it's, of course, also a matter of how much time gets lost on the way between the interaction and the tribunal. If the decision is with the institution, how long will it take until that decision is rendered? So
that's service.
That service, internally, we have the goal that whenever an institutional decision has to be rendered, or if it's just an advice upon consultation by the tribunal, that we render that within 48 hours. That's the goal. And we hope that somehow the lower engagement, of course, adds to the expeditiousness of the proceedings, and that we only have to really an intervening power when it comes to costs at the very end.
So the presumption is that efficiency is enhanced by a lower engagement by the institution. Is that what you just?
Well, it should.
It should. Okay. Before Annette, one more thing. You all have ad valorem systems, right?
Yes.
In compensation, just so that we're clear on this. Annette.
No, that was what I wanted to sort of comment on, because I think that sometimes when we talk about the compensation to arbitrators and the complexities and so forth, we forget that there are two, completely different systems out there in terms of remunerating arbitrators. It's ad valorem and hourly based, and the ad valorem is not, in essence, based to amount of work. It's the base is related to the value of the dispute, yes. And it's for the so the parties will know this is the size of my dispute, and this is how much I will have to pay for have the size of this dispute decided. So it's not really related to the amount of work put down by the tribunal. And sometimes I get mixed up when we have this discussion whether fees should go up or down. Having said that, though, of course, when there is down the line in our system, and I'm sure in the others as well, when you have a case that is sort of exploding over its limits in terms of procedural objections and jurisdictional hearings and separate awards and what have you, you come to a point where you will, in fact, consider the time spent. But that is the exception. The most important thing is the value of the claim or the claims. And that is what we primarily are assessing from the institutional side. And that doesn't always mean that that's a number written in the brief from the party. It is actually what's behind this number. What is the aim, the ultimate aim of this dispute? What are the parties in fact arguing about? I think we touched upon this earlier, Carita, before we came on board here. What is the ultimate value of this, sort of the company or what have you? I mean, that could be challenging to find that out. What we find in our experience is that tribunals will be very helpful in finding out the true value of the dispute in the end throughout the case and inform us of this. It might be more difficult to find out if the value is not as high as we have thought, so there we need to do some more digging ourselves potentially in terms of reading the statement of claim and statement of defense when we receive it. But again, I think it's important to make that, to have this clear that there is this distinction between time spent and the value, and that has consequences.
It's Heidi, I think, first,
Sorry.
and then it's you. But the SEC does ask for the time spent.
Yes, if we are, for example, in a settlement, so you are deciding the case early, and we need to decide a fee which is not 100% of what was initially decided, then we will look at how far did this have this case reached. So it's a matter of understanding how much work of the grand total has this tribunal spent. And then, of course, the time spent will help us in understanding that. And yes, if we are making an assessment whether or not this case has exploded over its limits from a procedural perspective, the time spent will, of course, be one of the helpful assessments in that review, for sure.
Heidi?
Yeah, just to continue from Annette's point, so I think, of course, the monetary value is the starting point, but as said also in our rules, so there are other things that you take into account also, such as time spent and complexity of the case. And here, of course, it's helpful if the arbitral tribunal explains clearly what has the process actually included, how complicated has it been, and tell a little bit more about the process. I think here it has been a learning process in Finland when we started with our new rules. So we received very little information from the arbitrators. But now more and more information is given, but I would say that here the modesty is not the best way to go forward. So I think the arbitrators should explain a little bit more what they have been doing and how was the process.
But when fixing the advance, I know you want to say something, but in fixing the advance, how insistent are you if no figure is given? How prepared are you to go out and say, hey, look, you say that this is just a very small dispute, and this is my favorite example, is that, but you're actually fighting over ownership of this company, and the market cap is X hundred millions, you know, you say that you're just sort of that this is a non-quantified claim, but there are these arguments. Are you prepared, or is the Secretariat prepared to go to the parties and say, hey, look?
That's what we normally do when we get the request for arbitration. If it doesn't include any monetary value for the claims, we ask for more information. Sometimes we receive the answer that it's impossible to define the monetary value. And of course, sometimes it is the case that it's difficult, but in most of the cases, as you said with your example, so there is the possibility to define the monetary value, at least an approximate value. And that monetary value will take into account when we calculate the advance on cost.
So you don't sort of go belly up if they say, I can't quantify it, you said, okay, fine. So you would say, well, hey, come on, you know, look at this.
Yeah.
Okay, good.
It's a preliminary number, one must remember. Yeah. So it's if not enough information is given at the outset of the case, of course, a decision has to be made in terms of the advance so the case can go forward. But like I said, I think in those cases where there is this big company that's really the dispute is all about, I think that will sort of self-regulate itself more or less as the dispute goes along, because that will then become evident to at least the tribunal.
I am not pursuing this monetary discussion just because I think that it always comes down to money. I don't think so, but I do think that it is considered maybe to sometimes be the least transparent part of an administration, that, you know, to the extent that there is a discretionary portion, I think people, I say people, various players wonder how exactly, what is the assessment, and assume that there must be some culture, how we normally do it, absent particular circumstances. Alex?
Yeah, I think for the purposes of this discussion, it's really fortunate that we're all proceeding on the basis of an ad valorem system, that we don't have really to discuss. It's 22 minutes.
Okay, you see,
You don't need to do that. We have
thank you,
better
Alex.
visitors.
I
You're
know I
welcome.
could always rely on you. You're service-mindedness. Yes.
Thank you. So I think that takes care of that part. I agree with everything that has been said, but there are two distinct issues. Determining the amount in dispute may or may not be linked to the question of remuneration of the arbitral tribunal and adequate remuneration of the arbitral tribunal. Because, again, the preliminary finding on the advance on costs is subject normally to readjustments, and I would actually argue that, by contrast to a situation where the tribunal decides, then the tribunal does not decide when the opportune time to do that is or is not. And even under the UNCITRAL rules, Philip, the rules provide that the parties might actually elect for an arbitral institution to review the cost findings of arbitral tribunals. And I sense that that rather obscure for the time being provision will be used more and more. I think what we are about to see it a little bit more, because we are also providing services in ad hoc and non or other institutionally administered proceedings. So that might be important. So on the basis of that distinction, I think there is indeed an element of I wouldn't say lack of transparency, but some varied degree of comprehension from users and arbitrators, of course, as to how fees are ultimately determined and therefore how advances on costs ultimately play out, even in an ad valorem system. The first thing I think that one needs to consider in that regard is whether, again, the institution moves in a more domestic, regional, or international environment, because players in different jurisdictions or different regions will have different approaches. The more uniform those approaches are, the more uniform the approach of the institution will be. Very often you will have permissions or discretion for parties and arbitrators to come up with a fee arrangement, even within an ad valorem system. For instance, under the ICC rules, that is not permitted. So that takes care of any expectations that an arbitrator will have, that in my jurisdiction, for a case like this, I would anticipate remuneration of X. So that is really not that relevant. The second thing is that most institutional rules do provide criteria upon which the institution itself will base its assessment on how to remunerate the arbitrators in the end of the case. And those are really not that surprising. It's the diligence of arbitrators, it's the efficiency of arbitrators, the time spent, timeliness of submission of an award, and of course any other specific circumstances that may or may not exist on the face of a particular case. I think money is always a sensitive matter and will always make some people a little bit jumpy, because parties and arbitrators will not necessarily see eye to eye.
In this part of the world, we're sometimes a bit jumpy.
I wouldn't think that it's only in this part of the world.
No,
it does happen. I think it does happen across the board, because someone pays and someone's expected to get paid. And in a way, the institution is there to kind of alleviate both sides of the unnecessary implications of that, and take part of the heat for it. Also,
Now we'll take a yes/no quick. Okay, Ulrike.
No, just one little comment, because I think fixing the costs, or the costs as such, are one of the utmost debated things in arbitration, and that's a matter of predictability. And if the amount in dispute is not predictable, cannot be determined in a predictable manner up front, I think that's also a lack of trust and transparency for any user. And I think that's what we owe to the users. I mean, on the one hand, for the arbitrators, it's nice if we earn money, and if you start dividing your hours by the amount you spend, you receive, and you come up to a horrible number of, it's close to Red Cross donation, you know, what you did, then, I mean, you can do that once in your life or once a year. But, I mean, I think we have various aspects of costs, and to me, the utmost is to promote arbitration, and promoting arbitration is predictability and transparency, and that's why, to me at least, fixing of costs, and by that also in an ad valorem system, fixing the amount in dispute belongs to the institution, because there at least you have a practice. If you have declaratory relief, do you take the entire amount which is behind? Do you just take 25%, 50%, whatsoever? You can have all ranges of different approaches. And depending on the tribunal, how it's constituted, you have the utmost funny decisions which come out, and that takes away much predictability.
There is no consistency in that sense.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think this is one issue which we face currently with the DAS. It's not only the horrible situation if you sit there as an arbitrator and you fix an amount and then the party says, oh, no, that's different, you know. That's horrible. But that's, I mean, you must survive that and support that as an arbitrator, otherwise you go home. But in order to promote arbitration and what the benefit of arbitration is, I mean, I think there must be some very clear corridors on which you can rely, and that's also cost.
The institutions, see if we take Switzerland and Finland and Sweden and the ICC, yes or no, you can put up your hand. Do you think that you are capable of explaining in detail and comfortably, transparently, exactly how that discretionary part is applied? Yes?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes. And yes, yes, I heard you.
We will.
I heard you. How much is it now? Now that I don't need to watch the clock, how much is it?
16.
16. What I propose, there's so many questions, and some suggested we shouldn't talk money here because we'll have a panel on cost, but on the other hand, that's cost allocation. So this is sort of determination. There are many questions open, but I'd like to open up to the floor now to make sure that there is at least 15.5 minutes left for any questions.
Where is your...
Can I?
We have this mic to throw, don't we?
Yeah, we have a
cube.
Jose, you have to wait for the cube. I don't know where the cube is. There it comes.
If he gets a 6, he can put the question.
Jose, he just told me this morning he's now a Scandinavian by the grace of God. Please.
Thanks to you. Thank you, Carita. I have a question very much related to the title of your panel. And this is a question for all of you, is whether you're considering or not to play a more active role regarding third-party funding. We all know that third-party funding is now increasing its presence in arbitration and creating several legal issues, but my question is rather related to the conflict of issues. Just to limit, the purpose of my question is to be limited to the conflicts of interest or preventing conflicts of interest in the middle of the proceedings.
Annette, you start.
So this is obviously an issue that we need to explore further. I mean, third-party funding, I think one could either see as an access to justice issue or actually a funneling or increasing disputes in general. And is that good for transactional cost in the economy at large, one could ask. And then, of course, you touched upon the issue of conflict issues related to third-party funding. I don't have a clear answer on sort of if the SSC has an initiative in that. More than to say that this is something we are looking into and that we are following, and down the line there may be certain initiatives or that we need to make in terms of routines. But I do think it's important that when we do discuss third-party funding, that we do it from these both sides. That we are approaching the issue neutrally, so to speak, looking at the access to justice side, but also looking at the fueling unnecessary, if there are such things, disputes.
Anybody else who wants to say for his or her institution? Alex?
Yes, so it's a very interesting question. Obviously, it's an issue that has not really I think been in the center of getting a lot of light in terms of disclosures by arbitrators so far, in my experience. But it is something that I would suspect we would see more coming up. So in terms of independence and impartiality, I also see that it might have an impact in the work that institutions will have to do. I think what the ICC, through its Commission on Arbitration in ADR, has done is raise some of those points for parties and arbitrators to be aware. It is encouraged that issues of the existence of a funder be revealed, not only for reasons of contract, but also for reasons of cost considerations very early on in the case, if that is indeed necessary. And I should also perhaps point out that, although not really a question of conflict, one of the very few court judgments that have considered a validity of an award on the basis of the existence of a third-party funder and the impact on costs was rendered last year by the High Court in London, and that was an ICC case, which means that the ICC court had to scrutinize that award.
Thank
At
you.
our board, board and secretariat, it has not been on our agenda yet, but of course it's a very, as you said, an interesting question, and there are many questions relating to it that when the case comes,
Yeah.
so there are things to
I think
be
it will
discussed.
be
Yeah.
for the future. Are there other questions now? Yes. Anja, please. And please state your name for those who don't.
My name is Anja Haverdal. I'm a legal counsel at the SEC. I have a very specific question about about separate advances on costs for the other institutions. Do you have? I mean, I can't remember who it was who said this. I think it was Maria and Inka before. That of course, when you have the claimant claims 2 million, and then there's a counterclaim for 200 million, then it's obvious that separate advances on cost might be appropriate. But what if it's more like 70% and 30% claimant, 70% respondent? Like, at what point does separate advances on cost become appropriate at your institutions?
Under our rules, whenever the tribunal considers it appropriate. That's easy answer.
Yeah, that applies to these two.
At the Finland Arbitration Institute, for us, the global advance on cost is the starting point. And of course, if there are special reasons to have separate advances on cost, it's possible, like the example Inka and Maria had, but still the main rule is the global advance on costs.
Agreed, and it's not really the amount in dispute on either side of the spectrum. It's really separate advances are designed to unblock proceedings, and not so to the extent a party does not take issue with the fact that for 10% of the claim it might have to pay 50% of the advance, which very often is the case. They will not say anything and pay up for different reasons. Then obviously, from an institutional perspective, you have no reason to interfere there. It really has to come from the parties, and really has to come in a situation where the global advance has not been paid, and even in substitution from the non-defaulting side, I mean. So I think that is really the only consideration.
Other questions?
We have 10 minutes, if that helps.
It does help. Let's see if it helps the audience. Then I will ask you, Alex, why doesn't the ICC administer VAT?
We do administer VAT fund accounts.
You provide an account.
We provide the
yes.
service. As I think is the point of the law, by the way, consider that is a matter that is exclusively between to be regulated exclusively by tribunals and parties. I think it's also logistically very difficult to enter into a legal exercise that would involve 150 countries around the world, and their VAT, their tax legislations and places of incorporation of companies that might be paying, law firms and diverse arbitral tribunals, and finding out the precise formula for every single one of 1,600 pending cases. So in that sense, I think we do provide whatever we can, which is tell us that there is an obligation, and then we will help you in securing that the funds are here and that you will be able to receive the VAT amount whenever you need it.
Heidi, would you like to explain how the Finnish chamber goes about this?
So we are administering the VAT, and we are, when defining and calculating the advance on cost, we are also taking into consideration the possible VAT that has to be added to the fees. It's not necessarily something that we at the Secretariat like very much. It's a service we do. It's a complicated service, and of course we are not trained tax experts, but we are we are becoming tax expert here, but that is a service we are doing, and of course it requires quite a lot of resources and time to do it, but we see it as a service to.
But you do ask in the first instance, right, the assessment of each arbitrator as to his or her obligation in view of the parties to pay, and then do you go for an average, or do you take the maximum possible VAT amount?
We try to take the maximum so that we have all the money required if in case VAT should be paid.
I believe the SEC, you have in the arbitrator guidelines, you have...
I was nervous you were going to ask me about VAT.
Yes, yes, I know. I think that it's as tough to you as it's for the arbitrators, but I think you have
so
the guidelines.
I was actually looking at the guidelines coming over here just to refresh my memory, and it was almost the, I don't know how many percent, but a large majority of the guidelines is devoted to tax issues, which is sort of depressing, but that's the way it is.
Yeah.
And as for the details, there's actually Anja here is much better expert than me, or maybe I should ask Suvi, who is no longer with the SSC, but with the DIS. But on the details of how we charge. But in essence, what we do is that we ask the arbitrators, you know, it's their responsibility to inform us, and then we make room for it when we collect the advance on costs to make sure that in the end, when the award is delivered and there's any VAT, the money is on their account. I mean, to cut it very brief, that's the way it's done. And all the details are in the arbitrator's guidelines, including other very complex tax issues.
Thank you, gratefully. Thank you. Did this trigger any? Now, there is one question that it might not fall squarely under our topic, but I would like to ask, I start with Philipp, when there are cases where the Swiss chambers would appoint an arbitrator, so how do you find this guy or gal?
Well, maybe I have to explain a bit how the inner workings of the court. So each case has a so-called case administration committee, so a rapporteur and the vice rapporteur, so two members of the court follow the case from A to Z. So they read the request for arbitration, the answer to the request. They also, of course, involved if it comes to the determination of the number of arbitrators, if that is not provided for in the arbitration clause or if the parties do not agree. And then depending on applicable law, seat, industry, type of contract, and so forth, the court members know the arbitration community. I said, well, of course, in many instances, we have a Swiss seat, we have Swiss law, even though neither party or no party is Swiss. So then many times to choose a Swiss, and the statistics show that is more or less a bit an obvious choice, but even if it is adequate to look for a national abroad, our court members are well linked within the arbitration community. They're all practicing.
So it's in-house intelligence. If I ask you, do you have a list?
No, we don't have a list. We have for, I can say, I can disclose in that sense that there is
no, we don't have
a list for potential emergency arbitrators. When we introduced the system, we approached a number of people and asked them whether they are available in principle, subject that they are available then at the particular point in time and free of conflict to act as emergency arbitrators, and those who have stated their interest are on that list, but we would not necessarily pick an emergency arbitrator from that list. We also go outside.
Ulrike, does a DIS or...
We have the appointing committee at the DIS, which consists of various members predetermined.
But no lists?
No list, no hidden agenda, pure knowledge of the market.
It's in our, I think this is, the reason I ask this, even if it might sort of go a bit, is that this is a frequently asked question, okay, because there are certain institutions who say we have a rooster, we have list, and that is normally in emerging jurisdictions, sort of emerging and some former CIS countries, but otherwise it's like you say with a certain pride, no, we don't have list. it's open. And then the next question, the follow-up question is, well, how do you go about it, you know? Okay, Annette.
Well, I suppose it boils down to how do you define a list, right?
Yes, okay. Now you're talking, yes. Okay.
So, of course, we all have knowledge, and whether you call that a list or not, but it's when you ask if you have a list, for me, that's a formal list where you have applied, and you have sort of references and what have you, and then it's, of course, a big thing. Can you remove someone from the list? I think that's one of the big difficulties with the list once someone is put on the list. So in that sense, we don't have formal lists, but we have an informal list, meaning that's what's in our knowledge, people we have seen acting in our cases before, being appointed by parties, that we have appointed before, that we have been recommended to us, that raised their hand to us and said, hey, I want to be an arbitrator, and by the way, I have this experience from these other institutions. And I think this is probably one of the most challenging things we have as institutions. It's by constantly appointing the right person for the right case and making sure that we have enough knowledge of potential people to appoint, or potential appointments. It's so difficult. I cannot tell you how difficult it is, because you really want to be sure that you have the right person in place for this case. And it is not enough that it's a very impressive CV, that even made a very impressive speech at a conference, because you want to have someone, either yourself or someone in your board or someone close to you in the appointment process that has seen this person in action, in an actual case, as counsel, or most preferably as an arbitrator. So that, of course, narrows it down, because it comes to the network of people working at the institution, having worked at the institution, and sitting in the board of the institution. But I think there is just no other way around it. You need to have that personal experience. Having said that, though, we always encourage, when we sit in contexts such as this one, for people, and I have done that in Helsinki before, and I have received emails after that, so thank you very much for those of you who sent them to me, that we always encourage, and I think that's for all of us, we always encourage, for those of you who have arbitral experience or want to start an arbitration career who have not yet done so, to let us know that you exist, because otherwise we can't go anywhere. And be part of our knowledge and our pool, or whatever you choose to call it.
May I assume then that there's also no blacklists?
No, there are no blacklists.
Because I'll tell an anecdote. It's probably 25 years ago, long before you were at the helm of your institution. They said, no, we don't do the ICC pre-scrutiny, but you bet we read your awards. And if it's not what we would hope it is, I bet you will never be appointed again. So I thought, well, I guess that must be also, there is some reason to it, no?
Well, I mean, an assessment or review, if you want, whatever you want to call it, of the performance of an arbitrator, be it from counsel or from the Secretariat or from the board reading the award. I know that this is happening in Finland, for example. I think that's one thing, but that's not a blacklist.
No, okay.
That's understanding.
So it's arbitrator intelligence.
That's understanding the competence of this particular person and how they performed in a particular situation.
Mm-hmm. Alex, you look so unusually troubled.
I was a little bit, but I'm glad it was 25 years ago, so that puts a very safe distance from all of us with that. But I don't know what it means that if the award is not what we hope it is, because that sounds something.
I know it's bad if it's sloppy, I guess.
But it's true that I mean, you would assess performance, and hopefully not just at the stage of the award, but throughout the life of the case. And if there is a tribunal or a specific arbitrator who does not meet the requirements that are set out under any institutional rules, yes, then that person, that professional, probably will have trouble convincing, well, first and foremost parties, but then ultimately, of course, the institution to select him again.
And
again, this
sense.
is an open, it's an open choice method. In a way, your reputation depends on your delivery.
It is now exactly, Heidi said that, okay, Philipp, we have to allow Philipp to say.
That's very kind. Just following up on Annette's solicitation of interest to sit as arbitrator, I think the institution also play an important role to increase the pool, Alexis Moore, of potential arbitrators Alexis Moore was referring to in his speech. And it's in particular and I guess the ICC will experience that as well with the expedited procedure. Most institutional appointments under the Swiss chambers are done in expedited cases for sole arbitrators where the parties are not able to agree. And these are exactly the cases where institutions also have to show some courage and appoint someone who does the job
Yes.
for the first time. And I think that really is of important. That's an important task for all institutions.
Very good note to end on. And what we didn't discuss more was the obvious interface between the institution and the tribunal. Maybe that was the main topic for today, but I think that everything you've said has been very, very interesting. Thank you very much, and I hope that the audience agreed. Let's give them a big hand.